Hi, Tim.
Hi, Rosa.
How are you?
I'm good.
Welcome to Blogging Heads TV.
Thank you. This is my maiden voyage on Blogging Heads TV.
I hope it will be a smooth voyage on Blogging Heads TV. Doesn't bode well since this is our second start attempt after some minor technical problems. But we should start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Rosa Brooks, a columnist for the Los Angeles Times and a professor at Georgetown Law Center. And you are, who are you?
I am Timothy Noah. I am a senior writer at Slate magazine, and I write the Chatterbox column, among other things, at Slate magazine.
And the last time I saw you, Tim, which was a few hours ago, you were feverish, hallucinating, and in a state of total fluish delirium. So
I have staggered forth from my sickbed, yes, to participate. So if I'm not very sharp, then I will blame it on my illness.
Okay. We'll try to be kind and understanding, and if you say anything about leprechauns, we'll know why. So we have a bunch of things that we're going to talk about today, and we were going to start by talking about what the hell is going on in Russia and Georgia and with U.S.-Russia relations. Specifically, is the Cold War starting again? What does this mean? How did we get to this sorry state of affairs, and what does this actually mean for the election? And then we're going to talk about a few election-related issues finally. But let's just plunge in and talk a little bit about the question that you raised, which is the Cold War starting? And this is actually kind of scary, especially for people who are old enough to remember the days when we spent a lot of time worrying about fallout shelters and the Russian menace and so forth.
Yes, in some ways, in fact, I think it's a little more frightening than the Cold War, because the Cold War, at least by the time I was aware of it as a child, had developed certain orderly patterns, and whereas in this instance, the Americans and Russians are kind of improvising their level of hostility to one another, and that is extremely nervous-making. It's not as clear as it was during the Cold War what the actual rules are.
Well, and one of the things that we actually had, certainly by late in the Cold War, we had pretty well-established communications channels with the Russians on multiple different levels. Despite all of the hostilities, we had lots of ways to talk to them. Yeah, it's basically what you were saying, whereas now it does feel like nobody knows what's going on, and we're barely speaking to each other, and it feels a little bit out of control.
Right, plus the among the various ways we intend to counteract the Russian invasion is we are cutting off all sorts of... we're cutting off many of the regular few contacts that we have with Russia. We're talking about kicking the Russians out of the G7. We're talking about killing this agreement that was struck just, I guess, a couple of months ago, right? Where we were going to have more communication between the two countries. So it is a frightening time, I think.
It's right. I find it incredibly depressing, partly because we're seeing right in the middle of a crisis that seems to be escalating rapidly. We're seeing the U.S. continue to do some things that look likely to escalate still further. Actually, let me back up and say, I don't mean to suggest that the blame here is entirely the U.S.'s or something, because obviously this crisis wouldn't be happening if the Russians hadn't been looking for an opportunity to flex their muscle, looking for an opportunity to flex their muscle in a way that among other things, has caused the displacement of unknown numbers of civilians, the deaths of unknown numbers of civilians. I think if you were going to apportion moral blame here, the Russians get most of it.
Right.
But
the Russians are behaving in an evil way. It appears that we are behaving merely in a stupid way.
We're behaving in a really stupid way, and one of the things that kind of floored me, well, I mean, a couple things. We're behaving in a really stupid way partly we have very little leverage over the Russians in the last few days. Nevertheless, the Bush administration has been making statements, all of which take the tone of, we insist that the Russians do this, we demand that the Russians do this, the Russians must do this, which, given the context, which is that we in fact have very little capacity to make the Russians do anything, and we don't have a whole heck of a lot that they want right now, just seem, when you're dealing with a large nuclear power that is acting out of essentially a giant bruised ego in the first place, seem like, boy, those couldn't be more calculated to make the Russians sort of go, oh yeah, and how exactly are you going to make us? And we're just going to show you exactly how little power you have over us by doing exactly the opposite of what you just told us that we must do. And then we're compounding it by doing stuff that we know is going to make the Russians crazy, like the missile defense shield deal that we've just cemented with Poland.
Yes, can just describe that a little more fully, because that I think that might be, it's kind of buried in today's paper, but it might be the biggest news of the day.
Well, this actually, maybe we should actually take a step back and sort of, before we even do that, and talk a little bit about, how do we get to this? How do we get to such a place where this kind of thing could happen anyway? Why on earth, why do the Russians think this makes any sense? How did we get to a place where we have so little ability to have an impact on Russian actions? We thought the Cold War was over, we were all supposed to be best pals. Not so long ago, Bush was gazing deeply into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul, and they were embracing and all that kind of stuff. How did this all fall apart?
Right. I believe Bush even gave him the nickname Pooty Poot, which could be right there. That's Casus Belli right there, right?
Pooty Poot? Did you actually say Pooty Poot?
Pooty Poot. I have read this. Yes, that he. Possibly behind his back, I don't know. But
no wonder the Russians are going to war, damn it. That's all I can say. My God, that is yes, yeah. It's. I mean, all of this seems like, in hindsight, such a tragedy, and my sense is that the Russians have been. The end of the Cold War, for us, was this great triumph. We won, our system is better, ha 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 ha. That'll teach you to embrace communism, and now we extend our helping hand. This was pretty humiliating for the Russians.
And we tended to think in terms of absolutes, is my recollection. Russia went overnight from being, the most dangerous enemy in the world to this pathetic shell of a country.
Right.
And in retrospect, it seems as though we were wildly underestimating the amount of power that we'd be able to wield.
And wildly underestimating something that again in retrospect seems kind of obvious. I mean, if you think about U.S. nationalist sentiment and American patriotism, that if we were brought low, as someday we may be, then we would be pretty sensitive to patronizing help from outsiders. And we were pretty patronizing. We couldn't resist quite a lot of crowing and quite a lot of, well, told you so, guys. And so the help we offered was help that was offered in a way that was experienced by the Russians as pretty humiliating. Not only that, it was help that didn't turn out to be, a lot of the time, all that helpful.
Well, I think that's the bottom line, is that we failed in our attempt to create a thriving market economy in Russia.
So from the perspective of the average Russian, American help in the immediate collapse of the Soviet Union was just a complete disaster. It led to this tremendous nostalgia for communism, which wasn't all that appealing, obviously, but also a lot of resentment towards both Americans for being the West for being patronizing, and also resentment of the West for sort of visited this catastrophe on them, this economic catastrophe. Life expectancy in the former Soviet Union was plummeted, et cetera, et cetera. Crime went up. It was a huge, big mess. Then along comes Putin, and one thing I have to hand to John McCain, he had that quip about, Contra Bush looking into Putin's eyes and seeing his soul. McCain quipped, I looked into Putin's eyes and all I saw were 3 letters, KGB. I think McCain was a lot closer to being right than Bush was there. Putin kind of says, give me the power I want, and I will give you back your pride, in effect, if you don't mind making a whole lot of trade-offs along the way. And essentially he did that, and he partly did that by cracking down on democracy, by taking away the freedoms that had been fought for and granted. And he partly did that because Russia gets lucky because of changing world markets for oil and gas and so forth. So Russia, rises up from this position of feeling really humiliated. I can't remember the exact GDP figures, but they've just gone up astronomically, so suddenly Russia's really rich, but meanwhile the US and the rest of Europe continue to treat Russia as if they're this sort of non-entity state that we don't actually need to take very seriously because they've been defeated, they've been humbled, they don't really count. And meanwhile they're thinking, oh yeah, actually now we're rich and we still have those nuclear weapons, so they're kind of angry, they're pissed off, they're looking for an opportunity to show us how arrogant we are. And meanwhile, what are we doing? We have kind of Bush, we meaning at this point the Bush administration by now, which is not to excuse the Clinton administration for various bits of stupidity and missteps with regard to Russia, but by now we've got the Bush administration. Bush is first kind of all in love with Putin, but isn't really particularly following that up with any meaningful steps towards a U.S.-Russia dialogue. It's all kind of fluffy stuff. Then as Putin begins to show his true colors, Bush begins to kind of yap at him and say, bad, be more democratic. But it's completely hypocritical because, of course, we are at the same time not making the same kind of criticisms of equally autocratic regimes elsewhere that are our pals in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And this, of course, rankles in Russia just the same way all of the other kinds of U.S. humiliations have rankled. And we're also pushing these two things in particular that are driving the Russians bananas. One of which is fast-track NATO expansion, bringing their former satellite states and former Soviet republics into NATO, which drives them nuts because it's the final bits of dismemberment of the former empire that they once ruled, and the other is the missile deployment. That the U.S. gets this idea, which frankly I think is a crackpot idea. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seemed pretty crackpot to me. That we need to defend Europe and ultimately ourselves against missiles being lobbed at Europe by Iran and maybe someday Al-Qaeda, by having these missile defense systems installed in Europe. Specifically, we get the idea we'll put them in the Czech Republic and Poland. There are only sort of two problems with this, one of which is that there is no evidence whatsoever that these missile defense... Well, actually three problems with this. First of which is that there's no particular evidence that Iran has the capacity or the will to shoot missiles at Europe. Second of which is that there's no evidence that these missile defense systems would actually work defensively to effectively defend Europe or anybody else against incoming missiles in that manner. And the third is that this drives the Russians bananas because they see this as, given that this seems to be an ineffective defense against a non-existent threat, the Russians say, we can't think that you're doing this for any other reason except to basically have these missiles be secretly pointed at us, Russia.
Right, and we have now confirmed their suspicions because in light of the invasion of Georgia, we, in our final agreement with Poland, said that we will be pointing some missiles at Russia because now we feel that Russia does pose a threat. Obviously, from the Russian point of view, this sounds very much as though we've been conning them from day one about our true intentions.
And that's like the complete out of control nutsiness of it all. Because I actually do completely believe, I actually completely believe that there was no prior intention to have these missile defense systems be targeting Russia. That they, however stupidly, but they were stupidly but genuinely intended as part of a dumb plan, dumb but lucrative for various defense industry players plan to defend against Iran and Al-Qaeda. It was all, that it really didn't have anything to do with defending against Russia or anything like that. And indeed, we made various not very major efforts to reassure the Russians. We could have done a lot more, but this really rankled for years. Indeed, the Czechs and the Poles didn't particularly want these missile defense systems stationed on their territory because they didn't really want to piss off the Russians.
They've got kind of a bad history of provoking the Russians.
Yeah, we kept trying to come up with better ways to sort of bribe them by offering more military aid if they would do this. Putin at one point, the Russians kept saying things like, this really makes us nervous, we regard this as hostile, why don't you use Russian territory, we'll work with you on this, let's come up with some kind of European, Russian, American dialogue, maybe we could put some of these missile defense systems on Russian territory if you're so fired up about having some kind of Russian, missile defense system, let's work something out. We were sort of going like, no, we don't, we're not really that interested in doing that. We weren't really very interested in talking with the Russians about ways to reassure them on their concerns. So we get to this situation where they're, we want fast-track NATO membership for Georgia. We want to go full speed ahead with these missile defense systems. They're more and more thinking, we've been humiliated, we've been beat up, the U.S. is acting hostile to us. We've got to do something to show them that we have to be taken seriously and that they can't stop us. We have to teach them a lesson. Georgia is partly about teaching the U.S. a lesson. And then the horrible irony is that our response actually ends up confirming all of their worst suspicions that we were after them all along, which in fact I don't think we were. And that's what you're talking about now, which is that, maybe you want to say a little bit more about that, which is, as you say, kind of buried in today's news.
Now let me ask you, I want to raise a couple of things. First, to get back to Russia, obviously Russia is the morally culpable party here. They invaded Georgia. They seem to have invented, as a casus belli, a mass slaughter that, according to Human Rights Watch, did not take place, at least based on what information we've been able to get now.
Although, to be completely fair, it was at a minimum, it was phenomenally stupid of the Georgians to decide to use force to try to retake South Ossetia at this exact moment in time.
Right. But I think Human Rights Watch has only been able to confirm 44 deaths, and most of those were soldiers, not the civilian population.
Right.
So Russia is behaving in a very wrong way here, and I feel that part of it is understandable and part of it is mystifying. The understandable part is obviously that Russia regards Georgia as part of its sphere of influence in much the same way that the United States regards Latin America as its sphere of influence. And there are always questions about how hostile how much hostility you're willing to tolerate in countries that are in your own backyard. In the early 60s, we tried to overthrow the Castro regime in Cuba. More recently, the Bush administration has been troubled by the anti-American regime in Venezuela, although we haven't really done much about it. So, this is a familiar geopolitical perspective, one that we, I think, pretty much took for granted, not just in extending or trying to extend NATO membership to Georgia, which in retrospect was highly provocative, but as you point out, even under the Clinton administration, we perhaps should start to ask ourselves whether it was wise to spread to offer NATO membership to all sorts of Eastern European countries. I think you could almost invent a little parlor game called Who Would We Fight For in NATO? NATO traditionally has been an alliance that regarded an attack on any one of its member nations as an attack on all, and that was taken very seriously.
Traditionally, that's the deal. That's the treaty.
Right.
That's the treaty obligation.
Right. It's explicit. Now the question is, would we really enforce that treaty language? Would we have enforced that treaty language if Georgia had been a NATO member? I tend to think not. Well, then you could say, well, what about Poland? What about the Czech Republic? I actually have my suspicions that there are actually very few Eastern European nations that the United States, in its heart of hearts, regards as, I think there are very few instances where the United States regards democracy in Eastern Europe linked intimately to American national interests. Or would you agree or disagree?
I think that's sort of the wrong question. I mean, I think that or rather, I would say, yeah, on some level, as the last week's events in Georgia show, when push comes to shove, there is no way in hell that the United States is going to get into a shooting war with Russia over preserving the sovereignty or the territory or democracy in Georgia, period. It's not going to happen. And I don't think that would have been changed had Georgia in fact been a NATO member. But that said, I think that, the reason I say that's sort of the wrong question is that I think that the fantasy and perhaps the fantasy was, and it needn't have been a fantasy, but for missteps made by certainly the Bush administration.
And possibly the Clinton administration as well.
And possibly the Clinton administration as well. The fantasy was that the question you asked is an absurd question because of course Russia is not going to go after these countries militarily. What an absurd idea. So there's no cost to the United States of pledging to support them militarily because the only military threats to these states in the 21st century are going to come from Iran, they're going to come from Al-Qaeda, and Russia will be our ally. And therefore, there's just no issue there. So that we are all going to be united. And of course we would defend Georgia from Iran. Of course we would defend Poland from Al-Qaeda. You betcha. No
Right.
problem. And I think, and the thing that is sort of sad about this, I do think that the sort of fast-track NATO expansion, when it was very clear that the Russians were going from, in the 90s, saying, ooh, we feel a little nervous about this, to going to more recently saying, we regard this as acts of aggression, was stupid. That said, I don't think it had to be that way. I think that the Clinton administration certainly did a much better job than the Bush administration, partly because the times were friendlier to them. They just had better luck, right? It was that things. Russia was weaker. Russia needed our help more, etc. than it has in the last 7 years. But I think that even in the last 7 years, there were ways to do that. There would have been ways to do that would have been going a little bit more slowly. I think maybe NATO expansion would have been okay for the Russians if we hadn't simultaneously been pushing the missile defense system deployment, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was that we started doing all these things at once that felt to the Russians like, oh my God, in every possible way, the United States appears to be trying to say, A, we don't care about you. We're not, we basically abandoned all of the sort of complex multi-issue dialogues with the Russians that have been carefully maintained by multiple prior administrations. We lost interest in the nuclear dialogue to a significant extent. They kept trying to resuscitate it. We were sort of, we weren't that interested. We weren't interested in talking to them. We were doing all these things that they saw as aggressive. That they felt threatened in every possible way, and that was kind of unnecessary. That's because that's why I think the thing about the agreement, which has now been finalized, according to today's news, to finally station the missile defense system on Polish soil, is kind of a tragedy, because I think in fact there was no intention on the part of the Bush administration to be sending hostile messages to Russia. They weren't sitting around in the White House saying, let's up the ante, sending hostile, threatening messages to Russia. They were sitting around saying, oh yeah, the Russians are our friend. They just weren't thinking about it.
Right. And this gets back to another issue, which is, and I think this is genuine. For the last, I don't know, 5-6 years, it's actually been very difficult to understand what's going on in Russia. Certainly for me, and I suspect also for the American government. For one thing, yes, Russia is wealthy now, but it's oil wealth. International economists refer to the curse of oil wealth as being kind of disastrous for economic development in any country. So how did Russia manage to establish itself as a superpower purely on the basis of oil wealth? Saudi Arabia isn't a superpower. How come Russia is? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm not sure Russia is a superpower anymore. I'm not sure we're going to be a superpower anymore either, actually, but that's another story, right? But yeah, I mean, I'm not a Russia expert. But, my sense is that there is a real debate among Russia scholars about, is Russia going to go the way of Angola, and other countries that have been sort of crippled by oil wealth? And there's certainly, my understanding is certainly if you look at the internal indicators, that there's a huge disparity between the sort of external trappings of power in Russia and a lot of the internal indicators. And Putin has succeeded in selling a bill of goods to some extent to the international community and to his own people as well. I keep referring to Putin because even though, of course, there is a new Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who once bet as Hillary Clinton, it's become even more clear in the midst of the current crisis that Putin continues to hold the reins, effectively speaking. But what I mean that he's been able to sort of sell people a bill of goods is that while Russian GDP has skyrocketed as a result of oil and gas prices, that the Russian economy, as you said, Tim, is extremely overdependent on those two commodities. And he's sort of succeeded in creating this impression that Russia is now rich and that the bad old days of the 90s where everything was bad and people were poor and there were lots of crime are over. But in fact, that if you look at life expectancy rates, if you look at crime and homicide rates, if you look at alcoholism and HIV infection rates, that sort of pretty much across the board in terms of internal social indicators, things are as bad as ever, if not actually worse. What there has been a surge of government spending in certain areas that kind of make people feel good and create the impression that things are getting better, even though for most ordinary Russians things aren't getting better. And that's partly been accomplished by the anti-democratic crackdown. The Russian government now essentially controls the media, so everybody's only getting the, hey, things are great message. And that, to some extent, has sort of tricked people into thinking, aha, Putin has restored prosperity, Putin has eliminated crime, even when things are just as bad.
Right. As an American, though, I find myself deeply puzzled by the fact that Putin managed to maintain the support of Alexander Solzhenitsyn until he died.
Yeah.
The most famous human rights crusader in Russia for the last 50 years. And he also has maintained warm relations and support from Mikhail Gorbachev, who, while not considered a great hero in his own country, is admired for his understanding of realpolitik and for presiding over the breaking up of the Soviet Union in the West. And I just find myself sort of scratching my head and saying, how did he... Is it just that these guys have such a deep sense of nationalism that has overridden all other considerations in their minds?
I don't know. It's a really good question. And I think my guess is that probably that last answer you threw out is the right one. That I think that we Americans, even though we are a very nationalistic country in our own way, we consistently tend to underestimate the power of nationalism in everybody else's country. That we underestimate the degree to which even Russian liberals, experienced the 90s as humiliating and experienced the sort of Russian resurgence, even if it may be to some extent to some extent artificial and to some extent may sort of contain within it through over-reliance on oil and gas and so on, and the seeds of its own ultimate destruction, experience that as incredibly gratifying and are kind of willing to say, now we can stand up to the world again. And
which is baffling. I mean, you want to ask, where are the dissidents? Certainly, if I were living under that sort of regime, I think I would want to object to the curtailment of freedoms, maybe even object to the extreme violence committed by Russian troops in Georgia. Is it that these people have been silenced? Is it that they don't exist? Surely there must be some.
You might want to, but then you might reflect on the number of journalists who've been found shot in the head, and you might then reflect on the number of NGOs that have been forcibly dissolved, and you might reflect on the number of people whose reputations have been ruined with planted rumors and so on, and then you might decide that it's probably better to just shut up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the Russian government has had such an effect, has so effectively silenced dissidents, both by ensuring that there is no way for them to get their voices heard by squashing independent media outlets, and by literally being willing to squash, and in some cases, people ending up dead in suspicious circumstances, the actual individuals who try to speak out, that they have, to a very significant extent, both reduced the number of dissidents and prevented the few remaining ones from having any ability to get their voices heard.
Right.
So it's very hard to know the extent to which there is internal dissent. It is sort of back to the bad old days.
And what's troubling is I don't get the sense that the Bush administration knows the answers to these questions any better than I do, and it seems to me that given that, they ought to be treading a little more lightly.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and that's what scares me too, is just this sense that the Bush administration is really playing catch up, that they're still, it's like they've got a time frozen vision of Russia as if it is still the year 2000 when Russia was much, much, much weaker economically, was much, much weaker politically, was much weaker militarily, and they still think that we just don't need to pay that much attention to Russia, and that Russia really needs us. Whereas the Russians are thinking, it's quite clear that the Russians are thinking to themselves, we don't need you, you need us, if anything. And to some extent, they're right. They're not so much directly right about the United States. They're certainly, to some extent, right about Europe. They provide, I think it's about 25% of Europe's natural gas. And they have shown a willingness to close the spigot to punish countries that aren't doing what they want them to do politically. Part of the reason that Germany ended up vetoing or quietly indicating that they would oppose fast-track membership action plan for Georgia into NATO at the April NATO summit was the Germans were rightly concerned that they would find a dramatic reduction in their gas supplies if they really pissed off the Russians. So Russia right now does have a lot of power. It holds a lot of cards, and the U.S. does not actually hold a lot of cards. The Bush administration seems like on some level they haven't quite figured that out, and that's what makes it kind of scary. I mean, so your earlier question, Tim, was, well, it's the curse of oil, the curse of gas. Is this going to last? Well, maybe it won't last, right? It could very well be that this moment of power and muscle on Russia's part, that it will collapse in a decade or in 15 years. But if you've got nuclear weapons and you've got that degree of economic power in the short run, you can sure make life pretty miserable for a whole lot of people for 10 or 15 years. So it's sort of cold comfort in a sense that, it may not last.
Right. Maybe the answer is imagine Saudi Arabia with a lot of nukes.
Right.
Right. Well, should we talk about the political campaign?
Yeah, and maybe the sort of segue into that is one of the things that kind of shocked me, and I keep thinking I'm sort of unshockable, but one of the things that actually did shock me was something that's been getting a little press lately, and I in fact wrote about it briefly in my most recent column, which was the link between the Republic of Georgia and the McCain campaign. And one of the many minor mysteries in this whole mess. We were sort of saying, well, what, how did this happen? How did this escalate so quickly? Why is it escalating so quickly? One of the many mysteries in all of this is, what was Saakashvili, the president of Georgia, thinking? Why on earth did he think that the Russians weren't going to come down on Georgia like a ton of bricks? The Russian response is appalling. It's disproportionate. It's terrifying. It was also completely predictable, given everything. So
this is where the fog of war makes it a little bit hard to know how this actually started. I have seen in some accounts that the Russians started shooting first.
Very unclear, but there it seems to be the case that Georgia. Either way, it seems to be the case that Georgia probably could have laid low and didn't. Certainly, for whatever it's worth, the Bush administration seems to think that Georgia did some kind of dumb stuff. I mean, their eagerness to say, we told them not to do this.
Right. Privately, we told them not to do it, while publicly we egged them on.
Right. And so
the Georgians tried to use that. They tried, for example, to leverage humanitarian assistance from the military as a military operation to protect the ports.
Right.
So clearly, they are trying to trap us into a greater military commitment than we're willing to provide.
Right. So they are being manipulative too in various kinds of ways and trying to make it look as if they have pledges of support right now from the U.S. that very clearly they don't have, and the U.S. doesn't want them to think that they have, which makes this all very complicated because pretty much nobody in this is telling the truth, probably. But the thing that sort of shocked me that I hadn't known until recently, I was aware I was aware of the previous little sort of micro scandals about the number of lobbyists who played active roles in McCain's campaign, and that last spring he had, partly as a result of media pressure, sort of had to really crack down and require campaign aides to cease and desist from taking funds from outside sources and so forth. But I hadn't been aware that Randy Schuneman, his top foreign policy aide, not only was a former lobbyist, but was a former highly paid lobbyist for the Georgian government.
And when you say former, you mean until quite recently, until something like June or May?
Yeah, right, up until mid-May.
Basically until the press made enough of a stink about it that he had to give it up.
Correct. And that indeed, up through the NATO summit, etc., that he was both taking, through his firm, a lot of money from the Georgian government, and advising John McCain, prepping McCain for telephone conversations with the president of Georgia and so on, urging McCain to make statements supportive of Georgia's claims over South Ossetia. And that really kind of shocked me, because on the one hand, I think it may very well be the case that McCain would have taken similar positions even if his top aide hadn't been in the pay of the Georgian government, But the whole issue about this stuff is, well, you don't know then, do you? And it also made me think, well, gee, no wonder the president of Georgia, another reason the president of Georgia might have thought, well, gee, I've got the full backing of sort of the U.S. govening establishment. Bush and Rice are making these supportive statements, and
I've got McCain
John
in my
McCain
pocket.
kind of in my pocket. Yeah.
And it's when I first came to Washington in 1980. Believe it or not, it was considered deeply unethical for campaign workers to participate in lobbying. The pioneers in this were Black, Manafort, and Stone. It started, I guess, maybe in the mid-'80s. But there used to be a strong kind of moral prohibition against this for precisely this reason, and that eroded over the years. Then the prohibition was, well, if you're working on a campaign, then you're working on a campaign. You can't work for the campaign and be lobbying at the same time. And I think in the last couple of years we've seen that prohibition erode too. And it's not unique to the Republicans. Mark Penn was found to be lobbying for the Colombians, or
right? Yes, it was the Colombians.
So I think this is an example of an area that was always kind of hard to police through election law, but there was some vague recognition of decency on the part of political consultants.
Why is this hard to police through election law? I mean, to me again, this sort of seems like a no-brainer that if a person is running for, a person is an elected official, as McCain and Clinton both were, an elected official of the United States government, they're both senators, and running to be president of the United States, that their paid staff, their paid foreign policy staff, should not be simultaneously in the pay of foreign governments.
Absolutely.
That doesn't seem complicated.
But they have found that they can get away with it. And I have to say, which is shocking, but I have to say I don't actually think that this, I don't think this is going to hurt McCain very much. Sad to say. I think that McCain's level of at least perceived engagement in the Georgian crisis has probably helped him rather than hurt him, especially since Obama had the bad luck to be on vacation in Hawaii this week.
Which is not part of America.
Yes.
It's a foreign country, right?
Yes. Cokie Roberts last Sunday said one of the most odious things I can recall a pundit ever saying, which was, she said, I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but she said that he shouldn't be vacationing in Hawaii. I know it's part of America, she said reluctantly, but it seems too exotic and foreign. And
it's full of.
He should be really instead. He should be vacationing in Myrtle Beach, huh?
I think it's really part of China or something. Maybe I don't know. It's somewhere far. Like isn't it like in Asia?
Well, the first thing I thought of when I heard about it was, Christ, what's the last place in the United States that came under foreign attack by another country as opposed to a terrorist organization? Well, that would be Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They were American enough to be bombed by the Japanese on December 7th, 1941. How dare Cokie Roberts question Hawaii's Americanness, even in the guise of trying to guess what most Americans think. Most Americans are, in fact, not that bigoted and xenophobic. It's a terrible thing to say, and it's a terribly condescending thing for her to say, and I'm surprised she didn't take more flack for it.
So why don't you think this is going to hurt? I'm perfectly willing, in fact, to grant that even if his top foreign policy advisor hadn't been taking big bucks from the Georgian government, in fact, a good deal more money from the Georgian government than McCain was paying him, that McCain's position on Georgia probably would have been the same, frankly, because that's been pretty consistent with McCain's positions on these issues. What I worry about more, I feel more sort of sorry for the Georgians who look like suckers here, that there they were sort of getting on the phone with good old Randy Schuneman, McCain's top aide, and their paid lobbyist, and they're saying, we think our cause in South Ossetia is just, and we will do anything it takes to get it, back into the fold. And good old Randy saying, "Hey, we're with you all the way, guys." And,
right.
Thanks a lot, Randy. But why doesn't this hurt McCain? I mean, it can't just in terms again of the optics. Do we want a president whose advisors are all taking money from foreign governments?
I think that most voters will not be paying attention to the fact that McCain has a top advisor who until recently was making a lot more income off of the Georgians than he was out of the McCain campaign. I think instead people
just
will
private
be paying
enterprise.
What?
This is just private enterprise.
Right. I think people
Right.
instead will look to McCain. They'll think of him as the voice of experience in a moment of international crisis. I think they will like his belligerence in this, because in times of international crisis, American voters tend, against their better judgment, to admire belligerence. He's making an appeal to American nationalism. And Obama, I think, is very wise not to do so, but I think that comes at a price. I must say, as a Democrat myself, I don't think I'm giving anything away here, this whole episode makes me all the more anxious that a Democrat be elected in November, because it's getting to the point where I am genuinely fearful of the influence of hawks on American foreign policy.
Say more. I mean, how much? Thinking about McCain's response to this, there's almost a funny note of, thank God we don't have to talk about that kind of complicated, weird, non-state actor terrorism stuff anymore. We can get back to something that is, we know, Russia,
Right. He's got a lot of neocons. He's got a lot of neocons advising him, and neocons were beside themselves when the Cold War was over. They went into a terrible funk, and they pulled themselves out by taking on political correctness in universities, and they got a few years of mileage out of that.
Probably wasn't as satisfying, yeah.
But it wasn't, it was small beer compared to the Cold War. So they
kicking
eventually
out a bunch of undergraduates.
But eventually they discovered a cause in Iraq, and I not to be too cynical about this, but I think part of what's going on is McCain is heavily reliant on neoconservative advisors, and I think a lot of neocons are thinking, consciously or unconsciously, this war on terrorism gig, it's really hasn't been all that good for us. We haven't been able to actually win it, and we've had to concede that the Iraq War really didn't have much to do with
But we won the Cold War
anyway.
once. Maybe we could win it twice.
Right, so let's bring back the Cold War. It's a golden oldie. And there is a palpable, and this has been commented on, I've seen in a few blogs, there is a palpable sense of excitement and renewal in commentary that we've been seeing in the last few days by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan and Charles Krauthammer. They are a little on the delirious side, and it's once again reminding us that these folks are not well acquainted with strategic and political reality. And
but this is really scary if that's the case, because say what you will. I mean, it sort of makes me miss Henry Kissinger, because this actually there was even this sort of revealing moment in I don't know if you saw, there was a piece in the Times a couple of days ago on McCain and Russia, which talked a little bit about McCain and Schuneman's ties to the Georgians, and there was this sort of slight revealing thing that kind of slipped by just as a side remark by McCain, where the article said something like, some have raised questions about whether McCain is kind of too hardline on Russia to the point where he risks just, increasing tensions in a way that could be dangerous and destructive. And one of the examples given was McCain has repeatedly suggested kicking Russia out of the G8. The article raised the question of, is that really useful? It's just a dialogue. It's just a forum for having conversations. Haven't we closed off enough of those? Isn't part of, and implicitly raised the question of, well, yes, we had the Cold War, but wasn't part of the deal that when you've got a really scary nuclear enemy, you want to keep talking. You want to keep those channels of communication open. And so then the piece quoted McCain as saying something along the lines, and I'll get this slightly wrong, of, yes, well, I know that some people sometimes say that, and when Henry Kissinger calls me up and tells me, John, you're being too hard on Russia, I listen to him. And what was revealing about that was that it suggested that sometimes even Henry Kissinger calls him up and says, John, you're out of your damn mind. You need to at least be talking to these people. And but that's sort of part of what is so scary about this. It's like you sense a sort of a nostalgia for the Cold War, only in a kind of hotter way. Without all of those rules. A
Right.
Cold War where there are no rules.
Right, which is, very frightening. I'd love to change the subject, if I can, to Jerome Corsi, the distinguished scholar who wrote The Abomination, a hit job on Barack Obama that is debuting at number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list.
How do you debut at number 1, anyway? How does that work?
In the case of conservative books like this, what tends to happen is that conservative book clubs buy up an enormous number of copies, and the bestseller list is actually pretty easy to manipulate because the overall numbers are pretty small. There aren't that many people in the country who buy books in the first place. So these books get bought up by conservative book clubs, and it creates a certain amount of momentum. Even if it doesn't create momentum in book sales themselves, it creates an enormous amount of media momentum. And, of course, the media, news outlets like Fox News and cable, MSNBC and so on, those reach a lot of people.
Right.
Not as many as network news, but a lot more than the book buying audience. And so these things have a kind of a multiplier effect. Mm-hmm. And what's disturbing about this book is that it's published by an imprint in Simon & Schuster. It used to be, when books like these got published, I realize I'm sounding a little bit like an old fart because I keep talking about how things used to be better.
Back in the good old days.
Right. But nevertheless, it used to be true that when books like these were published, they were published by fringe publishing houses and were kind of recognized within the press as fringe commentary. Regnery was the big publisher, to some extent Wiley & Sons. What happened was the major publishers, who are suffering in all sorts of ways financially, figured out that these books, particularly the more belligerent ones, are a gold mine. So they started separate conservative imprints. And the Abomination is coming out under the imprint, what's the name of it? I can't recall the name of the imprint, but it's run by Mary Matalin, who of course is not an editor. She is a political hack, and her training for the last 20, 30 years has been in the manipulation of truth, not the pursuit of truth. And so
the fact that she's married to Jim Carville never made me feel better about her.
No, well, that's a whole another kettle of fish.
Okay.
I will merely use this as an occasion to plug Reputation by Marjorie Williams, an anthology of my late wife Marjorie Williams' writings, which includes a very perceptive joint profile of Carville and Madeline. It's where the hell does Mary Madeline come off? Putting this sort of crap into the publishing mainstream. And she was quoted in the New York Times preposterously as calling this a piece of scholarship, and a good one at that. Well, this is based on the fact this guy Corsi has a PhD from Harvard. What she didn't mention was that he's a staff reporter for the Wingnut WorldNet Daily, that he was co-author of Unfit for Command, a similar hit job on John Kerry from 4 years ago, and that in his off hours he has written all sorts of vile, bigoted things on internet chat room sites, such as referring to Arabs as ragheads, calling Bill Clinton an anti-American communist, calling Susan Estrogen, calling Katie Couric,
Hey,
little Katie
that's
communist.
pretty clever, Tim. Don't you think that's pretty clever?
Now, apparently, he was on Larry King the other day, and he said, "Now, you should know I have apologized for those remarks," which, my feeling about that is, well, so what? But he clearly has not abandoned that way of thinking, because just a few weeks ago...
He's not really sorry. He's
right.
not, you don't sense deep contrition in his heart.
Right. Just a couple of weeks ago, he was on a radio program. I don't have the name of the host in front of me, but it was a white supremacist radio program. And he is scheduled to make a return appearance. Serious scholars do not do that. Bigots do that.
Right.
And of course, this guy, this white supremacist, has managed to get under my skin by referring to me on the air last week as the Jew Timothy Noah.
He's half right.
He's half right, yes, because I am half Jewish. This is the kind of sewer that Mary Madeline and Corsi, and by implication Simon and Schuster, are swimming in. And I sent emails to both Madeline and Corsi asking, saying obviously there are a few factual errors that have been identified in this book. Are you going to correct them in future printings, which is an absolutely routine practice in publishing? And they didn't answer. Of course they're not going to change them. This book is not about upholding the standards of truth. It's about trying to influence the election.
But okay, so I'm shocked that McCain has an aide who is in the pay of a foreign government, openly in the pay of the foreign government, and you're shocked that Simon and Schuster is making a buck by publishing this book by a slimeball bigot who basically tells lies about Barack Obama for political purposes. Why are either of us being shocked? Isn't this sort of just the way it goes?
Well, it shouldn't be the way it goes, and I recognize that my condemnation will have absolutely no influence on this. But I like to think that Carolyn Reedy, the publisher of Simon and Schuster, has a little bit of self-respect here, and I don't mind saying she ought to be ashamed of herself for publishing this book. So you're basically saying that this is new, just as you said about my point about lobbyists, that even a few years ago, the kind of brazenness with which this occurred, people would have been kind of ashamed of this. They either wouldn't have done it, or they've done it and been kind of ashamed of this, and it's become much more brazen and open, and that equally in the publishing business, that even a few years ago, the mainstream publishing houses wouldn't have wanted to go near this stuff, and now they're just kind of going, hey, everybody does it. You can't really expect us. We're holding our noses here, but you can't expect us to turn down the profits. Right. I'm thinking, for example, of this book called Fortunate Son about George W. Bush that came out in 1999 or 2000, and it contains some very damaging errors. I can't even remember what they were. But the publishing house, I forget which one it was, but it was one of the big mainstream ones, took the book back and pulped it. Now, you think that's going to happen with the #1 bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list? Of course it's not going to happen.
Well, do you think, separate question, but obviously, as everybody in the universe knows, there's, conventional wisdom is that in 2004, Kerry really was hurt by the Swift voting campaign and by the same guy's book, The Unfit for Command, which equally, everybody knows was full of untruths about Kerry, but they hurt him partly because Kerry sort of thought, why dignify them with a response? They're so obviously scurrilous lies. Do you think is this going to have? Is there a danger that this has a similar effect on Obama, or do you think that here's the more optimistic take on this, which is that the American people, who, as you said earlier, aren't as bigoted as Cokie Roberts may assume they are. We've seen this stuff before, and we also kind of know what kind of crap it is, and Americans just take it with many more grains of salt. Or rather, the Americans who don't take it with grains of salt are already lost. They're not going to vote for Obama anyway. And the rest of the country just kind of knows that this stuff is what it is. It's a tissue of lies.
Well, I don't know the answer, but I am very worried. Partly because Kerry was hurt by this in 04. Kerry was. I should add, though, that Kerry was a vastly inferior candidate to Obama in terms of political skills, yeah, it's worrisome. It's worrisome that clearly we're seeing a concerted effort in just about every attack on Obama to portray him as the other, as something exotic, something different from you and me,
skinny, very skinny.
Very skinny. Yes, I got in a lot of trouble last week
to be president.
For saying that the line that Obama may be too skinny to be president was a coded racist message, and I don't want to refight that battle. But I think that we're seeing coded racist messages everywhere. It's an effective, potentially effective, I should say, line of attack. It was used by the supposedly saintly George H.W. Bush in 1988. It has been blessedly free from our national politics anyway for the last 20 years, but it may be making a comeback. It is making a comeback, and I hope we will discover that it doesn't work this time. One deeply unfortunate thing, which I read the other day, is that Reverend Jeremiah Wright has a memoir that will be published in October, and I think this has to be read as proof positive that Wright is actively trying to torpedo Obama's campaign.
Well, again, I'm always more optimistic than you are on these issues, but here is the optimistic response. None of the stuff in Corsi's, none of the claims and allegations in Corsi's book are new, and to my sorrow, I have to say that virtually all of them were made or insinuated by the campaign of Hillary Clinton, and indeed nothing that Wright presumably is going to come up with hasn't already surfaced and been exploited by the Clinton campaign.
Right. We should mention that a memo surfaced this week from Mark Penn, Josh Green of the Atlantic Monthly, published online a memo from Mark Penn in which he said that Barack Obama was not fundamentally American, which is just a ghastly thing to say, even in the heat of the campaign.
But here's the good news. I mean, remember back during the primary campaign when Clinton was having these very negative attacks on Obama and sort of defended herself. The Clinton campaign kind of defended its tactics by sort of saying, well, he's going to face. If he can't take it now, how's he going to do it in the general election? Which was completely disingenuous, as if they were sort of doing him a favor by spewing all this hateful stuff. But on the other hand, there's a degree to which that was true. That they knocked themselves out to dig up dirt on him and get it into the public domain. And thank God on some level, because there was some stuff that could have hurt him. The right stuff, blah, 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 and the American public had plenty of time to kind of evaluate that and hear his response and so forth. And, he's the Democratic Party's nominee and she's not. And also, if you look at the sort of poll of polls, the poll averages, he's consistently been, not a hugely ahead of McCain, but he's been very, it's not changing, despite, you see these one poll come out and you'll get some headline blaring, McCain takes the lead or something. But I was actually just looking at this morning at sort of the various, averages of all the polls, and it's been very, very solid and very, very consistent. He's, 3 to 5 points ahead of McCain consistently. So the optimistic take would be he's already weathered these particular storms, which doesn't mean things couldn't change. Something genuinely new could come out. External events could happen that completely alter the dynamic of the race. But, this stuff in Corsi's book, this is sort of a tired rehashing of crap we've heard already. And it's not, it didn't affect him 3 months ago. With Democrats, it's not going to affect him now. Why would it affect him now?
It didn't affect the outcome, but it did affect his standing in the polls to some extent. I want to share a great nugget that was passed along to me by Jack Schaefer this morning, which is that, the National Enquirer is owned by an investment group that includes Roger Altman, who was an economic advisor to Hillary's campaign and was a Treasury Department official under Bill Clinton's presidency. And he apparently, somebody, I guess an unnamed former National Enquirer honcho, told the Palm Beach Post that people at the National Enquirer were explicitly instructed not to do any anti-Hillary Clinton reporting during the primaries.
I'm shocked.
So that's, kind of an interesting factoid. It's one of my little projects over the years was to try and sully Roger Altman's reputation by reminding people at every turn that he is a part owner of the National Enquirer.
Well, we're just about out of time here, so let me close with one other factoid, a factoid that I find kind of optimistic, and it relates both to what we've just been talking about, but also sort of goes back to the way we started this discussion of the elections, wondering whether the events in Georgia will help McCain, and you said that you suspect that they will, and so far as in a crisis, Americans like somebody who seems belligerent. Question mark, is that still true? With so much fatigue with the Iraq War, are Americans finally saying, the last thing we need is somebody who's going to go, get us into another conflict. One of the interesting things that came out, just hit the news yesterday, it hasn't gotten a whole lot of play, but it should, because it's significant on a whole bunch of different levels, both in terms of its potential implications for the election and in terms of its sort of sociological significance more broadly. A study just came out, it's on opensecrets.org, of political donations made by members of the U.S. military deployed overseas, which found that active duty members of the military deployed overseas donated money to Obama over McCain by a 6-to-1 ratio. Which is really interesting, right? I mean, we think of the military historically, at least since the late 70s, early 80s, the military has been a very solidly Republican voting bloc, reliably Republican voting bloc. And the fact that those members of the U.S. military deployed overseas, which is not 100% a proxy for members of the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, because obviously there are people in Korea, there are people in Germany, all over the place. But, given the numbers, that those people are likely to be folks who have been in conflict zones, are pretty resoundingly, in terms of the extent to which they're, putting their money where their mouths are. What it tells us is that they are really rejecting the candidate most associated with belligerence.
Right. I seem to recall also that they found that even when you looked at all military personnel, that Obama was ahead on donations, not by nearly as much, but he was leading, I think, within every service except for the Marines, which I guess means that we got to send Obama down to Paris Island.
Yeah, and this is this both suggests to me that the fatigue factor, and the sort of no more stupid, poorly thought through wars factor is going to continue to be big in this election. But it also, and this is a topic for another time, suggests that the sociological shifts within the military are likely to be enduring. But that is for another time. Mm-hmm. And I think we've gone on for a little bit over an hour, so it probably is time to close. Any last thoughts?
No.
All right, then let's just end right now.
Okay.
Okay, Tim. Thank you for joining me on Blogging Heads, and hope to do this again with you very soon.
Yes.
So
I enjoyed gabbing with you.
I will talk to you very soon.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye, Tim.
Okay.